Hello, everyone. I'll give you a second to get connected to sound. Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1250th New Social Environment. I'm Magley, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Monique Mouton and Louis Bloch. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Monique Mouton lives and works in New York. She completed her Bachelor of Fine Arts at Emily Carr Institute in Vancouver, British Columbia, and her Master of Fine Arts at the Milton Avery Graduate School at Bard College. Filament is the fourth solo exhibition Mouton has held at Hoffman Donahue. And our host today, Louis Bloch, is a Brooklyn-based painter and writer and a managing director of the Brooklyn Rail. His writing has appeared in the Brooklyn Rail, Hyperallergic, and Foley Journal, and his work has been shown in New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New Jersey, and Venice. And with that, I will hand it over to Louis to get us started.
Thanks, Magley, and thanks so much for being here to talk about the work, Monique. Excited to learn more about the current show. Um, Maybe we can bring up the slides and just jump right in with, I think the most curious aspect of this show is that you're using a new material, which is metal, both in aluminum panels that are the surface that you're painting on, and in terms of the material itself, silver point, bronze, gold that you're applying to the paintings. Would you be able to talk about how you got started with metal?
Sure. Um, so the idea or kind of initial inkling to um, start using metal point was, I guess, a friend of mine, another painter, Eli Bornowski, was showing me some of his drawings that he made with silver point. And um, I hadn't really thought about it as a material before, but I became interested in the way that it is sort of opposite in terms of um, its application than the way that I was working before with mostly watercolor and very watery paints on paper. The silver point or metal point is a very like determined fine line. And but at the same time, there's a lot of subtlety and nuance to it, which I related to um, in terms of the the things that I had been working with before. Uh, and the aluminum panels that are new here, they kind of came from some experiments. Another friend of mine over 10 years ago, I think, had given me an aluminum lithoplate uh, because it was before I had started working on paper and was mostly making these shaped wood panels. And she thought maybe I could cut the metal and, have a different kind of material to work with. I never really did anything with them, but I pulled it out when I was just kind of in the beginning stages of thinking about this new work. And I really liked the thinness of it, of course, and how it related to paper. And it had this flexibility, but also a sturdiness to it. And so they kind of just, it's like these new materials came in because I was ready to shift, and it's almost through osmosis, through, you know, these things that other people had given me, or and then it started to kind of gel as I experimented with it in the studio.
And I think it's really interesting that it's both the substrate and the medium that you're using on that substrate. And then there's obviously paint and other materials in between, but the bottommost layer and the topmost layer are both metal.
Yeah.
Um, was there an interest in the historical application of silver point as a drawing material before graphite, or was it mostly just a material, an interest in metal as metal?
Both, I would say. I think um I definitely thought about it as this kind of, I mean, I was interested in the way it was a bit antiquated as a material. Um, and though not, I haven't necessarily, or I wasn't necessarily looking at silver point drawings, but um, in the past several years since I started showing with the gallery in Italy and spending time there and looking more at Renaissance art, um, I think that did have an influence on my thinking about it and interest in it. But at the same time, it is, I am interested in it as like the material substance of it. And that's why I decided in the list in describing the materials, I just put the material itself that I was drawing with. So in this one, I used fine silver to draw that kind of arch shape, because literally that's all it is.
And it's fairly unique in that it is like up close, an extremely precise line, way more precise than you could get with a pencil or a pen.
Mm,
Uh, but then in aggregate, on some of the pieces, those marks can sort of turn into clouds or ghostly images.
yeah, yeah. And that has a little bit to do with this, the different forms that I am using the metal. So I have some pieces here. Like this is a silver, this is just a piece of silver. So that is giving, that fine, delicate line. But then um, where it looks more kind of cloudy or smoky, I'm actually using this is a wool. Like there's different, it's kind of like steel wool, but this is aluminum, for example. Um, and so yes, even though it does have that very determined line, I found a way to get something more atmospheric.
Mhm. And then there are also these smaller pieces like what we're looking at now that are on panels that have linen on the front,
Mhm.
which is another departure, I think, for you in your practice. Can you talk a bit about the difference in applying paint and drawing on wood versus paper versus metal versus linen and how you're approaching all of those differently?
Sure. Um, the yeah, the linen is new and rather traditional for me, um, as I haven't painted on canvas or, this kind of substrate for a long, long time. Um, and what do I want to say about the differences? I mean, they each substrate has its own kind of material qualities, like the paper, it warps, it tears, I can put holes in it, I can cut it very easily. And it's absorbent. I generally use traditional gessos, which are also very absorbent. So even on the aluminum and on the wood panels, there's a way that the paint absorbs into the surface. And so that's kind of consistent across the board. And the other thing is that I guess the material connotations of the substrates themselves are part of what I'm working with. So that is almost the beginning of where I start to make marks is what is this surface? What is its shape, its size, and particular material qualities, and then it goes from there.
And are you working horizontally or vertically on the metal versus the paper? Or does it
Both.
sort of shift as you're going through the process?
It shifts. I move them around a lot. Probably more horizontally than vertically, just because I tend to use very liquid paints.
The other thing that's new is for for me at least with your work is this really specific aspect ratio and sizing for the panels. So I think almost all of them are 36 by 30 or 8 by 10 in this show. Whereas
Mhm.
the work on paper was obviously a bit more variable depending on the piece. Is that an intentionality that has to do with the material or maybe just a shift in the studio to working at the same scale each time?
Yeah, it's maybe the first time I've ever had a, this kind of work where it was on a standard format and size that was consistent across works. And um, really it was similar to, my interest in working with the metal point, where it was like a way to look at my work from a different perspective, like to shift the terms in this way, where rather than everything kind of being irregular, which it was, the paperworks were always cut from a roll. Well, there was one dimension that was often the same. The other dimensions were not, and the edges were wavy, and or the works on wood panel would always be cut with a jigsaw. Um, and so it was really about just kind of like turning around to look at my process from a very different angle. And for me, that was these standardized sizes.
Hmm. I was always curious if the paperworks were, you know, begun on the roll of paper and then cut out, or if you were always choosing the size and shape before beginning to paint.
In general, they were cut from the roll first. So I
Mm.
would cut a large sheet, and then um, and that would be the beginning of the work. But there are some smaller works on paper that were cut from a larger piece, or they developed a little bit differently, um, where maybe there was a large work that wasn't working and I decided to go a different direction and would cut it into a completely different thing. But
I
they
think we have a picture, Magley, of one of the framed watercolors that near the back that is actually two different pieces with a matte in between, and the tear sort of becomes a mark in the painting, be like towards the end of the slideshow. A little further. Yeah, that one, right? Slide 36. Yeah. And this is something that you've done a couple times, right? With multiple pieces of paper in the same frame.
Yeah, exactly. And so in this work, it's pretty obvious that it kind of came from a larger
Mhm.
piece that was torn, and I used these two sections from the same painting in this composition, I guess.
And this is a good one because it has all of these, it has an allusion to the landscape, both in the format and what is on the paper. And in the current show, there are these recurring images or motifs. A few of the pieces have an arch that goes across the surface, and there are these orbs or planetary forms sort of floating in space. Uh,
Mhm.
is the imagery in these pieces or in general ever referential to anything, or is it always just generative coming out of the process?
Um, it's, I suppose it's a little bit of both. Usually when there's a shape or something that is recognizable, a couple times there have been very obvious things like a hand or something. But usually I am interested in these forms that are very basic, and maybe almost cliche, in their simplicity and illusion. Um, and for me, that just kind of allows the shape to anchor something, but also kind of be completely abstract at the same time or completely non-referential. Um, the arch, I think there is just something very comforting maybe about that shape.
Mhm.
Obviously, there are religious connotations or architectural connotations, but it also makes me think of caves or, um, natural forms. Um, and so, like, that's an example of something that has, like, it has a lot of different ways a person seeing it could take it. But there's like a resonance. And that's what I'm interested in more than maybe a specific meaning.
Mhm. I know that you grew up in Colorado. Is there a landscape tradition that you were interested in when beginning to paint, or um, was there anything about the Western landscape that made it into the work?
Um, I wouldn't say directly there
Mhm.
was. I probably I'm sure I painted a couple landscape-ish paintings back when I was first beginning to paint. But there is maybe something about the space of the West, like the sky, and um, in that way, I relate to some of the desert artists like Agnes Martin, who she wasn't a landscape painter, but her work came from landscape a lot, or it had that feeling, or titles that referred to landscape. Um, and for me, I do relate to that abstract spaciousness, I guess. and light. Yeah.
I'm curious if you have a drawing practice. I mean, not you now are drawing in a way with the silver point, but do you keep a sketchbook or are there preparatory drawings ever for these pieces?
No, to be honest, I have never been much of a drawer,
Mhm.
which was part of the challenge of approaching this medium and how I think I wanted to extend myself for myself through it by working in this way that is not particularly comfortable.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, it's a new thing. I mean, when I was younger, I liked drawing. Like maybe in undergrad days, I had a little bit more of a drawing practice, but um, yeah, it's a new kind of.
The other consistency maybe is the word in the current show is that everything is this vertical portrait orientation. Um, and everything is untitled, which is new for you. I know previously some of the titles had been descriptive or lyrical. Um, was that a conscious shift just for these pieces or something new going forward?
Well, it's new and it's not new in a way. When I first started working on the wood panels, they were generally all portrait oriented ovals, and the work was always untitled. And maybe so it's not entirely new. And I think the reasons are similar for why I decided to do it in this work. But I guess the portrait orientation has like, it's about the relationship to, for me, there is a particular relationship to a person standing in front of the work where it's more of a mirror rather than the landscape, which kind of opens a different kind of perceptual um, sensibility, maybe. Um, but what
The
has,
36 by 30 scale is kind of like roughly torso scaled, it feels like in front of them.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And then the 8 by 10s, more like head scale, I suppose, but there's an intimacy to that portrait orientation and also this smaller scale. Um, and so it's that and the way that it relates to how how a person might experience it in the space. Um, I I always think about how we relate to looking at paintings. It's kind of an unusual activity
Hmm.
where we approach and we stand there and look or not, or you walk by, but there's something about this physical interaction that I'm interested in, and some of those formal or material decisions come from that.
Well, maybe that's a good transition to there is a slide near the end of the presentation of an installation you did last year, I believe, called Leaflet. Yeah, that one. Um, so this is a giant painting on multiple pieces of paper, and three-dimensional by virtue of having coming out of two axes, basically. And I know that you did a lot of research into Rudolf Steiner and laser painting technique, which involves layering a lot of thin pigments on top of each other. There are also obviously allusions to Italian fresco painting and even, Chinese ink painting on scrolls with the vertical landscape.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I'm curious how you mediated and adapted all of those different reference points for this piece.
Um, yes, thank you. You laid it out well. Really, let me think about that. All of those references they are built in, and the way that I start, it's really just like layering. I think that how I paint is generally a process of accumulation and accumulations of decisions and moods and memories and colors. And so, like, the Lazur technique was interesting to start with because it's layering, like you said, these very thin, transparent washes of color. Uh, and I feel like that is a very particular technique, but it correlates to how I'm thinking about painting and my work in general, where it's kind of just like slowly building and accumulating until it has these specific forms. Um,
And there are also these sort of framing devices almost in this painting that maybe bisects the whole piece into scenes or vistas like you know um, a Renaissance program would have on a fresco. Um,
mm,
but it does really move your eye laterally through the picture, and then you stop and look at a specific piece.
exactly. And in this piece, as I was making it, it's the first time I've made a work like this across several panels. I mean, they're sheets of paper, but if we talked about it as like each sheet was um, a unit, uh, and so as I was working on them, I would move them around, and I didn't have the composition set in my mind from the beginning. I started at different points across these sheets that were laid out on the floor of my studio. And in the end, I decided that for this work, it can um, be hung in different sequences. So there's a flexibility to the narrative, maybe, or that sequence that you kind of experience these moments within the whole.
And with the corner, the 90-degree corner also be flexible? Like, would you install this on a fully flat wall or in a different sort of space?
Yes, it could be on a flat wall, which would probably affect, I mean, it would definitely affect the reading or the feeling that the work would give, and perhaps the choice of sequence.
Was looking into the Lazier painting technique, did that come out of an interest in theosophical painting or thought forms or Hilma af Klint or anything like that?
Um, I love Helma af Klint. I'm definitely interested in some of the ideas that the Theosophists were working with, and the Lesueur, I have my cousin actually is a Waldorf teacher, and I think I learned about it through her. Um, but yeah, it's a particular intent and intention that you have when you're painting you're incorporating Lesueur to do it in the way that Steiner described is, not only is it the technique of having very thin washes of color that slowly build up, but there's an intent and a meditative quality to the process. And that gets, is meant to get infused into the painting itself. And
with watercolor and acrylic on paper, though, like depending on the type of paper, it can really actually take a surprising amount of layers and pigments. I feel like there is a maximum, and you can't go backwards from that once you've really loaded a section of the paper with pigment. Um, but I would imagine the aluminum panels are allowing for like a subtractive process or revisions now.
that's true. Um, Paper is definitely, or it depends on what kind of paper you have, like you said, but this paper that I use is not particularly thick, and but it does take a lot, and there's a lot of durability, but not, like you said, room for subtraction. It's really additive.
Mhm.
Uh, the aluminum, it does make more room for that. And I did in some of the works in the show at Hoffman Donahue, I think I sanded, or there were times when I made use of that.
Mhm.
Um,
Um,
at
should should we talk about the floor pieces as well? Just because we're talking about, the effects of the three-dimensional space and how you approach a painting. And these, the way that they're installed in the gallery actually move you in a specific way around the wall pieces. And um, we have a couple of different angle views of some of them, but when you're in the gallery, you can really see the sheen and the texture of the metal, but only if you're looking at them obliquely versus face on. But these floor pieces really, you know, make you think about where you are standing in relation to the wall and the pieces.
Yeah, exactly. Magli, maybe you could, I think up a couple slides shows the installation. Yeah, like one of these wider installation views. Um, and maybe go up one more. Yeah, where you can see both of them here in this image. Um, the floor pieces, yeah, it's exactly as you said. They kind of, it's like a stone in a riverbed or something. Like it alters the flow in the space, and it requires a different kind of physical awareness. And at the same time, you're not necessarily, it might not be something that you like stand and look at. But I I think in this whole um feeling that I have about how we move through architecture, how we move through space in relation to artworks. Part of that is also about the periphery, the like periphery of the space, but also our peripheral vision and how things look out of the corner of our eye or from an oblique angle, like you said, which I think these floor pieces are a little bit about that. Um, and I guess my hope is that they draw out that sensitivity also in looking at the works on the wall, where it is from sort of these oblique angles or out of the corner of your eye that you might catch a glint or see a different dimension or nuance in the piece.
And since you did, I mean, in some previous shows, you've had um, floor panels in relation with framed pieces, but you've also had wooden wall panels uh, as well. Are you beginning a piece on wood with an intention of it ending up on the wall versus the floor, or will that depend on, the color that's applied or the shape in any way?
Yeah, usually I am thinking of it as either a floor or a wall piece. The floor pieces tend to be um, different shapes,
Mhm.
I guess. They started out, I think, Magley towards the end. There are some earlier, um, actually, they come from a similar time. These pieces in my current show I made many years ago and ne had never shown. Yeah, I think 42. Um,
Are those
but
distinct, like discrete pieces that um, had existed separately and got put together in terms of the framed piece and the floor piece, or was there an intentionality of them, living right next to each other in the gallery when they're both being made?
these were individual pieces, and I wanted to say that this is kind of how the floor work started out as these like, kind of wobbly, narrow lines that hugged the walls and existed in these marginal spaces, but um, changed the rhythm of how of the works in the show. Like they were almost like punctuation marks between and underneath the pieces. So um, they're flexible, like they could be anywhere. This is how I installed them, but I was thinking about the way that they disturb the, like for example, the black one that's directly underneath this framed painting, how it kind of disturbs the discreteness of that frame um, and that work within the frame and almost like becomes a tail to that piece or it confuses whether it's one piece or two. Um,
It kind of acts as an analog to the black shape and the painting on the right as well,
mhm.
if you had like inverted it maybe, or it had fallen out of the frame onto the floor or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And so these things, it's almost like it's like as you walk through these shapes, these colors, these gestures accumulate and kind of form their own thing that's in addition to the individual works.
And you've also made a painting directly on the floor for a show in Italy, right?
I did, yeah.
How is the process of painting on concrete, right?
Yeah. Um,
I think we have a picture a little bit further up of that one. Yeah, right there.
yeah, so this piece, I wish actually now that I had included another view of the space that it's in, because it partly stemmed from this very unusual gallery architectural situation that this show was in, where um, you could viewed this room from the street, and this floor piece you actually had to look down through, like, the floor wasn't at street level, it was a whole story down below, and it was just an open kind of two-story space that you would view from halfway between, if that makes a little bit of sense. um And there were three like large paintings that were framed, hanging on the wall above it, floating. And so I think I decided to paint the floor in this way as a way to like um, add a little bit of like tether to this space that was very like tall and elongated. I wanted to, I guess, both draw that out and like give a very specific base to it.
Like a
Uh,
drop shadow or something.
Kind of, yeah. Or like a rug. I don't know, but I was interested in like kind of directly interacting with the architecture in this way. It's a very specific and difficult to describe architectural scenario, but um, it was fun to paint on the concrete with watercolor. Um,
Do you have to prepare concrete in any way, or does it just sort of sit on the surface?
it absorbed in just a little bit. Um, it was actually quite nice to work on. I didn't prepare it at all. Um, to be honest, and the gallery was very accommodating to me, kind of doing this experiment on its floor that I had never done. And I was just like, it's watercolor, it'll wash off. Um, I think it was harder to get off the floor than I expected in the end, but I just went for it. Yeah.
It's interesting, all of this, all of these ways that you're interacting with the gallery architecture. But then in the older framed watercolors, you sort of need to create architecture each time with the mat and the frame for the paper to live within. But that's more of a collaborative project with the framer, right?
It is, yes. The frames, yeah, I think that's a good term for them as a kind of architecture for the work. I, when I first started thinking about them, I kind of imagined them more like vitrines, or, like as these containers for these pieces of paper that had been painted on, um, almost in like as if the paintings were like anthropological um, remnants.
Mhm.
But I ended up in, as I thought about it more and was working with the framer, came to think of the frames as as these additional layers of sculpture almost and painting, like these additional decisions that kind of alter the viewing experience of the work, and have their own dimension. So yeah, all of these spaces, like what's behind the paper, the color of that mat, or in this case, it was painted, the frame itself, all of these relationships kind of become part of the work in itself. And for me, like it's like the way, like in this piece, for example, there's the gray frame that's painted on the paper. This brown shape, there's the white mat behind, and this dark frame, and all of those colors and lines and marks reverberate with each other. And then also,
Series of focusing in, like layer
yeah,
by layer.
yeah. I sometimes think of it as like an accordion space, like these like small decisions or these edges, these peripheries can be expanded, and um like rather like the work, even though it's a painting on a surface, it's also completely three-dimensional. Um, there's a behind, like my when I'm thinking about it, it gets me to like start to think about all of these other edges and dimensions and the porosity of it all, even though there are these lines containing that maybe they're not so contained as they seem.
Hmm. We do have that one picture of in the current show, a painting that's mostly white, but you can see the silver edge of the aluminum, and it's in concert with architectural elements on the wall. Like there's one piece that's next to, I think, an electrical panel, and there is this back and forth of edge that's very interesting, especially because some of the aluminum panels, since they're so thin, sort of become flush to the wall, but in other parts of them, like there's a little flare out from the corner that will have a shadow or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think one of the last things I wanted to ask about was the color palette for this show, which seems focused in a very cool direction. There's a lot of blues and blacks and grays. Um, Whereas in other shows that I've seen of yours, um, I feel like the palette is unique to each piece and not necessarily um, consistent across the whole show.
Yeah. Magali, maybe you could flip through a few more of the views just so we can see. Um, you can just scroll, or yeah,
Well,
like
let's start with the installation views or individual artworks.
either. I guess maybe the installation, then we can get the whole view, just kind of slowly go through. Um, to answer your question, Lewis, I think for this show, the reduced palette probably comes from or came from really just in my thinking, foregrounding metal point as as material and as their own colors, even though the difference between them is so subtle. Like the silver and gold, they both appear gray. Like for example, this is silver, but on that piece that is pretty much otherwise white, the gold is a gray. It's a very, soft gray. And I think the reduced palette maybe allows for more or requires more attunement to like the subtle differences between these colors. And it's also just kind of a mood, maybe.
Yeah, the metal kind of expands past the idea of like chroma or pigment to get include like maybe other axes of vision that you wouldn't necessarily think about, like with the reflective quality or the sheen.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that, I didn't start out planning for the palette to be as reduced as it is. But I think it was a result of maybe my own like attuning, as you said, to those subtleties and those nuances of the materials.
And did you say that some of the metal will change over time in terms of like tarnishing or oxidizing?
Yeah, so the silver and bronze and copper, they all oxidize and tarnish. So they'll shift over time, the works that have that. Gold and aluminum don't tarnish.
Mhm.
So this view shows both the frame and the work uh, from an angle with no lights on. I added it because I thought it would help give a sense of the dimensionality of these works and the surfaces.
I know that you just shipped off another group of paintings on metal for your next show in Italy, opening later in the fall. Um, are there any other projects that you're working on that we should talk about, or is this a mode of working that you're continuing in the studio, or any larger scale installations that you're working on?
Well, I have a show coming up in Milan at Veda, my gallery there that used to be in Florence. Um, and I used mostly the same materials, but the feeling of the work is quite different. So I'm excited to see how it comes together in the installation. And it's an exciting time for me because this is all very new and fresh in terms of just the potential for my work. So hard to say where it will go, but I feel like this is only the beginning of these explorations.
Awesome. Well, I'm sure we have some questions from the audience, but anything else you wanted to mention?
Um, I think I'm happy to turn it over to questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. That was so wonderful. There is a link in the chat for anyone who has a question for Monique. Feel free to ask a question and we'll turn right to you. The first question is going to come from Chloe. Chloe, I'll give you a chance to unmute.
Thank you so much, Monique and Lewis, for this conversation, which has been such a pleasure to listen to. Monique, there's a really great press release that accompanies this exhibition by Nancy Lupo. And Nancy talks about the sound difference in making this work. And I thought about that a lot looking at it, like metal on metal and just like that process. And I wonder if you can talk about the sound in that, but also if it shaped the way you made the work at all differently than when you're working with watercolor.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I love the press release that Nancy wrote. I mean, the sound, it's kind of like you would imagine. It's a little bit scratchy, like abrasive. Not always, though. It would kind of depend on which tool I was using and the paint that it was going over. But in terms of how Nancy brought it in the past, we collaborated on a show together in Florence a couple years ago. And I remember at that time she said something like, I always think of your work, to me, she said, she thinks of my work as like noise music. And I loved that. So I think that's part of like why she brought that in, is this like that there is, and it's really interesting because I don't necessarily think about it in those terms, but it does relate, like this atmospheric tone or sound. And for me, it's like the colors have that, but the corollary is this like abstract atmospheric noise music, or like this like, you know, the tinny scratchy sound of the these metal point materials. But the sound that it makes, I wouldn't say it affected the process too much. Sometimes I would listen to something in my ears so that I didn't, you know, when I was really going at it. But
Thank you for that answer.
Thank you for that question, Chloe. The next question comes from an anonymous audience member, and the question is, you so clearly respond to the space of the exhibition with intention. I wonder if there are certain spaces that you'd be excited to make work for or exhibit in.
thank you for that. It's true. I do feel like installing the show is any show is one of the most exciting parts of the process for me, because it's like making a new work in response to the architecture itself. Um, I can't think of a specific place or architecture that I would be particularly excited about, because each location that I've worked in has offered its own nuances for me to respond to. Um, though maybe related, I think I someday I would love to try fresco, um, and actually work into architecture in that way. Um, and yeah, I don't know, maybe a cave.
Thank you for that answer. To go off of that a little bit, I know earlier we were talking about some of the challenges that you face with nailing the pieces to the wall. Have there been any other challenges that you face in different spaces that you've kind of had to think creatively around?
For sure. Um, well, that first show at Veda where I did the floor piece, that was maybe a most striking example because it was a space that you couldn't walk into. It was extremely vertical and, viewed from an unusual point. And I'm trying to think if there have been any other. Bridget, can you think of anything? If you're there and feel like hopping in. I guess the thing I would say is that the challenge, prior to the large framed works, I was working with smaller wood panels. And even when I'm working on these paper pieces in the studio, I can move them around very easily. So I can like think about relationships and like I get to do this like dance of moving works around, but these big frames are so heavy that I have to ask other people to help and move them for me. So that has been a challenge of, where I want to see all of these different versions of a show, but I need I need the willing participants of the wonderful art handlers who move them around. And I'm just mentioning that I appreciate that a lot. It's a different kind of challenge.
That was it for our Q&A. Thank you both so much. I know, Monique, you wanted to close us off with a reading. I will give you a chance to introduce it.
Yes. So I picked a couple very short poems from Sun Ra, who's a musician. And I think it's nice because it relates to the sound that Nancy brought into the context. And also, I just love his kind of cosmic imagination. And I think it's something that is relevant in these times. Okay, so the first one is titled Energies from 1980. The cosmic rolls are written on sundry parchments, tinted with fire blue vibrations of flame, force field energies, abstract planes of sight and sound. And then the second poem is titled Reality Has Touched Against Myth. Reality has touched against myth. Humanity can move to achieve the impossible, because when you've achieved one impossible, the others come together to be with their brother. The first impossible, borrowed from the rim of the myth. Happy space age to you. Thank you, Brooklyn Rail, for having me. Thank you, Magley, for hosting and putting together the slideshow. And Lewis for your questions. And
Thank you,
everyone
Monique.
else for being here.
Thank you both so much. This was such an amazing conversation. Thank you, Monique and Lewis. Thank you, Bridget from Hoffman Donahue, for your support in preparing for today's event. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and the Tiger Foundation for making these daily conversations possible and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 25 years. A donation directly supports our writers, staff, and operations. Support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're free, join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Kadar Brock and Jason Stopa on the event of Coming Home on view at Miles McHenry Gallery. And as is Rail tradition, you can now all unmute and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you all so much.
Thank
you
you.
so
Thank you so
much.
much.
Such a fantastic conversation. Thank you,
Thank you,
Lewis.
Monique.
Thank you.
Thank you, Monique.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Monique, thank you, Louis.
Thank you so much.
Stay safe.
Bye, everybody. That was amazing.
Congratulations.
I want to see your work in a cave, Monique.
Yes.
To find a wall for you to
Absolutely.
fresco.
We'll
How
go to
about
see
a
the show
chapel,
first.
Monique? A
Hey,
little chapel cave.
Good to see you.
congratulations. Go to
Bye,
see
everybody.
it. Go to see the show, everybody.
Congratulations. Bye, everybody.
Congratulations.
Thank you all so much.
Ciao.